Breaking news that's dominating headlines across America. In a rare and stunning 9-0 unanimous decision, the Supreme Court has just sent a shockwave through the entire nation, delivering a ruling so powerful and so unambiguous that legal experts are calling it one of the most consequential constitutional decisions in decades. This wasn't a narrow 5-4 ruling where conservative justices barely edged out liberal justices or vice versa. This wasn't a split court with sharp dissents and competing visions of constitutional law. Every single justice agreed, from the most conservative to the most liberal, that something had gone seriously wrong with how constitutional principles were being applied across the country. When you see a 9-0 decision from the Supreme Court, you're witnessing something extraordinarily rare in modern American jurisprudence, something that carries weight and authority that fractured decisions simply cannot match. This unanimous verdict is the court speaking with one voice, declaring that the constitutional violation was so clear, so obvious, so undeniable that not even the usual ideological divides could create disagreement. Frame the national impact of this moment because it's massive. When the Supreme Court speaks unanimously like this, states have no wiggle room to resist. Federal agencies are forced to listen and comply immediately, and lower courts across the country must fall in line without any ability to reinterpret or soften the ruling based on their own preferences. This decision is already reshaping the legal landscape in real time. Laws are being challenged. Policies are being reconsidered. Legal strategies that seemed solid yesterday are collapsing today. And the consequences of this unanimous constitutional declaration are hitting governments, courts, and citizens right now. To understand why this 9-0 unanimous decision changes everything about the legal and constitutional landscape, you need to understand what unanimity means in Supreme Court jurisprudence and why it carries such devastating force for those on the losing side. A 9-0 ruling sends the strongest possible message the court can deliver to lower courts, state governments, federal agencies, and the entire legal system. There is no ambiguity here. There is no room for creative reinterpretation. There is no possibility of arguing that the decision was politically motivated or ideologically driven. When all 9 justices, appointed by different presidents across different eras with vastly different judicial philosophies, reach the same conclusion, that conclusion carries constitutional authority that's almost impossible to challenge or resist. This unanimous decision is the court telling every state legislature, every governor, every state attorney general, and every lower court judge that your legal theories have failed completely. Whatever constitutional argument you were making, whatever creative interpretation of rights and powers you were pushing, the Supreme Court has rejected it not by a narrow margin but unanimously across the entire ideological spectrum. Legal scholars explain that lower courts reviewing cases in light of this decision can't reinterpret what the Supreme Court said to soften its impact or preserve their preferred outcomes. State legislatures can't ignore this ruling and hope that future courts will see things differently. Federal agencies can't delay implementation by claiming they need time to study the decision or develop new regulatory approaches. The constitutional standard has been set with maximum clarity and maximum authority. This ruling carries the kind of constitutional force that reshapes entire areas of law, that invalidates not just one statute or one policy but potentially entire frameworks of legal thinking that were built on constitutional interpretations the court has now unanimously rejected. So what actually forced the Supreme Court to step in with such a powerful unanimous ruling, and what breakdown in the legal system made this dramatic intervention necessary? Here's what was happening across the country before this decision drop. States had been pushing constitutional limits aggressively for years, passing laws that stretched constitutional boundaries, twisted established precedents in creative ways, or in some cases outright ignored constitutional restrictions they found inconvenient or politically unpopular. Some states were implementing policies that clearly conflicted with constitutional rights, but were betting that changing court composition or evolving legal theories might eventually validate their approaches. Other states were exploiting ambiguities in previous Supreme Court decisions to argue that their specific laws fell into gray areas where constitutional restrictions didn't clearly apply. And this created an enormous problem for the legal system as a whole. Lower courts across different circuits were issuing conflicting rulings on similar constitutional questions. What was legal in one part of the country was illegal in another part. Citizens had different rights depending on which state they lived in or which federal circuit had jurisdiction over their case. Constitutional protections that were supposed to be uniform nationwide were being interpreted in wildly different ways by different judges. The Supreme Court stepped in with this unanimous decision because constitutional consistency was collapsing. The foundation of having one constitution that applies equally to all Americans was being undermined by a patchwork of conflicting lower court decisions and aggressive state legislation that pushed boundaries in different directions. Raise the stakes here because they're enormous. This wasn't about resolving one isolated case or clarifying one narrow legal question. This was about restoring constitutional order nationwide, re-establishing clear boundaries that all governments must respect, and sending an unmistakable message that the court will not tolerate continued defiance or creative evasion of constitutional limits. What did the Supreme Court actually rule in this unanimous 9-0 decision, and what constitutional standard did all 9 justices agree must be followed going forward? At its core, the court reaffirmed a strict constitutional standard that state governments, federal agencies, and lower courts must follow without exceptions, without shortcuts, and without creative interpretations designed to reach preferred policy outcomes. The justices made clear that when constitutional rights are at stake, governments cannot rely on vague justifications, cannot hide behind claims of important policy goals, and cannot argue that practical considerations or public preferences override clear constitutional limits. The ruling emphasizes fundamental principles about the relationship between government power and individual rights. Government power, no matter how well-intentioned or how popular the policy goal, stops where constitutional rights begin. There is no balancing test that allows violations of core constitutional protections just because the government thinks the outcome would be beneficial. There is no exception for emergencies or special circumstances that allows suspension of constitutional guarantees. And there is no deference to legislative judgment when the legislature has clearly exceeded its constitutional authority. The court's decision establishes an enforcement mechanism with real teeth. Any law, any regulation, any government policy that fails the constitutional test, the court has now unanimously clarified faces serious and immediate legal danger. States can't defend these laws by arguing they serve important purposes. Here's why this unanimous Supreme Court decision affects all 50 states immediately, not just the specific states that were parties to the original case, and why the nationwide impact is already being felt across the entire legal system. Because this ruling changes the fundamental legal framework itself, because it redefines the constitutional test that applies to an entire category of laws and government actions. Every state is impacted regardless of whether they were directly involved in the litigation. States that weren't parties to this case but have similar laws on their books are now facing the reality that those laws probably can't survive under the constitutional standard the Supreme Court just unanimously established. States that thought they were safe because their laws were slightly different or used different language are discovering that the court's reasoning applies broadly and dooms their approaches just as thoroughly. Describe the chain reaction that's now spreading across the legal system in real time. Pending cases in federal and state courts across the country must be reconsidered in light of this unanimous Supreme Court decision. Judges who were preparing to rule one way must now reverse course and apply the new constitutional framework. Cases that were dismissed because plaintiffs couldn't prove constitutional violations under the old, weaker standard must be reopened because the new standard changes everything. New lawsuits are being filed immediately by plaintiffs who now have Supreme Court ammunition backing their constitutional challenges. Civil rights organizations, advocacy groups, and individual citizens who were discouraged from suing because previous precedents seemed to favor the government are now flooding courts with fresh challenges. The immediate fallout from this unanimous Supreme Court decision is creating something close to controlled panic among state officials, lower court judges, and government agencies that built entire policy frameworks on constitutional interpretations that just got unanimously rejected. State officials are scrambling right now to understand the full implications of this ruling for their laws. Governors are demanding emergency briefings from their legal teams. State attorneys general are reviewing their entire code of laws to identify which statutes might now be constitutionally vulnerable. Legislative leaders are trying to figure out whether they need to call emergency sessions to rewrite laws before courts start striking them down. Lower courts are reviewing their previous rulings with growing concern, realizing that decisions they issued based on the old constitutional framework might now be invalid under the unanimous standard the Supreme Court just announced. Judges are issuing orders staying proceedings in cases where this ruling changes the legal analysis. Appellate courts are withdrawing opinions that relied on constitutional reasoning the Supreme Court just rejected. And government agencies that were enforcing regulations based on now questionable legal authority are seeking guidance about whether they should pause enforcement while lawyers figure out what's still legally defensible. Explain the fear rippling through state governments right now. States that pushed aggressive interpretations of their constitutional authority, states that passed controversial laws betting that courts would eventually validate their approaches, are now completely exposed. The legal foundation they built their policies on has crumbled. The constitutional arguments they relied on have been unanimously rejected by every justice on the Supreme Court. And they have no backup plan because they never seriously believed the court would rule this decisively against them. Highlight the enormous uncertainty that's paralyzing decision-making. Looking forward at what comes next in the wake of this historic unanimous Supreme Court decision, legal experts are predicting a cascade of legal challenges, emergency litigation, and rapid transformation of entire areas of law that were built on constitutional foundations the court just demolished. Expect to see emergency motions filed immediately in ongoing cases, with plaintiffs arguing that this ruling requires judges to grant immediate relief. Expect to see requests for preliminary injunctions seeking to block enforcement of laws that appear to violate the constitutional standard the court just established. Expect to see fast-moving challenges brought by plaintiffs who were waiting for exactly this kind of Supreme Court clarity before filing lawsuit. Still, other laws are going to end up back at the Supreme Court within a few years as states test the boundaries of the new constitutional framework and lower courts issue conflicting decisions about how far the ruling extends. Close this script with the authority and finality this moment deserves. This unanimous Supreme Court decision didn't whisper a gentle suggestion about how constitutional law might evolve over time. It thundered a definitive declaration that reshapes the balance between government power and constitutional rights with immediate nationwide effect. The constitutional shakeup it triggered is not theoretical or distant. It's happening right now in courtrooms across America, in state legislatures trying to salvage their laws, in government agencies suspending enforcement, and in the lives of citizens whose constitutional rights just got dramatically stronger protection. And this constitutional earthquake that started with 9 justices speaking with one voice has only just begun.